Okay.
Okay.
To our installments of our Scholar Spotlight series. Today we have David Valentine presenting on Husserl's reception, Kant's reception in Husserl and Heidegger, pardon me. Yeah. David, go ahead and take it.
I want to run it informally. I'm only doing a literature review, so there's a lot of literature. So I've got it all piled up ready and systematically to talk you through it, but feel free to interrupt. You know, this is not a lecture, it's a seminar. So, right, so I'm writing a couple of books with an academic at Glasgow University in Scotland, which isn't far from me, about psychology. And one of them is more clinical, but one of them is about the history of philosophy and the history of psychology. And he's trained as a phenomenologist. So Husserl, Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, these dudes are very much his bag. And I've long had a big gap in 20th century continental. I've been totally obsessed with the 18th century for a long time. So I thought, right, well, I need to get informed about phenomenology, its clinical uses eventually, but just get grounded. So I started on phenomenology, and I became aware quite quickly that Husserl and Heidegger were very much coming from the Neo-Cantian movement. So I'm going to talk about Neo-Kantianism quite a lot. Because I've discovered from about 1860 to about 1920, the dominant philosophical movement across certainly the German-speaking world was the Neo-Kantian movement, a Kantian revival. So Kant was briefly dominant, as we all know, till the early 19th century, especially at Jena. But very quickly, even in his lifetime, Kant was succeeded as he published and became famous very late in life. And Kant was succeeded, but in their own terms, by Fichte and a number of others very quickly. And Fichte launched Schelling, and Schelling launched Hegel, and so on and so forth. And Hegel became massively dominant, and Hegel's interpretation of all of that became very dominant very quickly. In the 19th century. But Hegel's reputation waned quickly in the second half of the 19th century in most places. Then Schopenhauer had a big run in Vienna. But around 1860 onwards, a number of schools were founded where people said, you know what, German idealism has gone wrong. We've lost our way. Where did we go wrong? Hegel is not the whole story. Schopenhauer is not the whole story. Schelling is not the whole story. Let's go back to Kant. And the Back to Kant movement had a number of starting points. And I might as well show you now where I've done a little display. Can you all see this? Is that clear enough? Can you all see all right?
Yes.
Or do I need to raise it up a bit? No, it's easier I keep it still rather than wibble it about. Guys, is that clear? Can you all see that?
Now it is. Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm just trying to get the angle right. So there's less light on it. Yeah. Okay, so I'll just put it a little higher with a few more books. Thank you, Kent. Right, that's better. Can you all see that? Good, yeah. Can you all hear me all right?
Yes.
Yeah, all right. So I've done it by geography. I didn't have room for a map. I would have loved, if I was doing a PowerPoint, I'd have used a map. So I'm going more or less from west to east during the Neo-Kantian movement. The famous centers of the Neo-Kantian movement is Freiburg, which is in the west of Germany now. Marburg, which is a little bit more central, but still in the west, but further north. Strasbourg, which you probably know is right on the border with France. So we're on the west side of Germany with Strasbourg, Freiburg, Marburg, and I'm talking late 19th century, early 20th century. There's Jena right over in the east, Berlin right over in the east, and Vienna right down to the southeast. So all these centers, there was stuff going on to do with Kantian reception. And generally there's a name associated, and these are more or less of the same generation. Simmel's younger, but at Freiburg, a guy called Windelband started the Neo-Cantian movement at Freiburg, started a whole school of saying, let's go back to Kant, let's start with Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, let's begin again like we did in the 1790s, 1780s. So that was Windelband. Hermann Cohen, a Jewish thinker, became the first German professor in Germany at the first Jewish professor in Germany at Marburg, same sort of time, 1860s, with interpretations of Kant, different emphasis, which I'll talk about. At Jena, there was Gottlob Frege. Frege is famous in the world of analytical philosophy, in the English-speaking world, because Frege was made famous in the English-speaking world by Bertrand Russell, more than 100 years ago, and then Wittgenstein, then after the war, especially Peter Geach and Peter Strawson and those guys. So Frege is a big name for analytical philosophy. I'm going to tie him into this story more. Also, Dilthey. Wilhelm Dilthey's a wonderful chap, very important, and has a relationship with Husserl. These are all sources for Husserl and some for Heidegger as well. And also, I'm going to talk about Franz Brentano down in Vienna. He didn't start down in Vienna. I'll talk about his story. He started at Tübingen, but he ended up in Vienna after some drama. And all of these guys, Simmel, I'll get to as well, over in Strasbourg, Simmel, Windelband, Cohen, Frege, Dilthey, and Brentano are all influencing Husserl. Windelband has a sort of disciple, Rickert, who lived a lot longer than all these guys, lived as long as Husserl, lived a long life. And Rickert is very important for the whole movement. He related to Husserl and to Heidegger at Freiburg, and Husserl succeeded him at Freiburg. There is a succession at Freiburg. Windelband was succeeded by Rickert, by Husserl, by Heidegger in the same place, down in southwest Germany. Simmel died just around the First World War, but he's a founding figure of modern sociology, and he was a big influence on Husserl, which I'll be talking about. Cohen discipled a chap called Paul Natorp, who was involved in the editing of the Kant archive and the Kant text that we use today, the so-called Academy edition of Kant. Natorp was involved with that alongside Dilthey over in Berlin. Dilthey inherited the chair that Hegel had inhabited at Berlin. It's the Hegel chair of philosophy in Berlin. So Dilthey's a major figure. He's a big figure in late 19th century philosophy, full stop. And Franz Brentano is well known as the founding inspiration behind phenomenology. Brentano starts an awful lot of things off, including Husserl. Brentano is very much the gifted teacher who gets Husserl started, and Brentano's effect on Husserl is quite similar to Husserl's effect on Heidegger. So I'm just giving you a little bit of the geography and history of the sequence, giving you a little map there. Is that okay? Is that clear to everyone? Yeah. So a sort of map. Now I'm calling it the Neo-Cantian matrix because one of the matrix, as in womb, you know, what the phenomenology, these dudes, Husserl and Heidegger, is born from this womb. And normally, when people write books today on the Neo-Kantians, they tend to mean Freiburg and Marburg, and those are the two schools recognized as Neo-Kantian. Simmel is not classed as a Neo-Kantian, but as a life philosopher, Lebensphilosophen, as is Dilthey. But I would say, from studying all of these guys for the last year, they are all on the same page. Brentano is the least Kantian of all of them. Brentano was not very impressed with Kant, and it was through Brentano's influence that Husserl took a while to get his teeth into Kant. But all of these guys have some interaction with Kant, and Husserl, I would classify, and I'll say this now, as very much a Neo-Kantian thinker. From everything I've studied, there's a massive debt. Husserl is very much a Kantian, especially in the second half of his life. So Husserl discovers the genius of Kant quite late, but that is the Husserl we know. Most people don't read the Husserl before he discovered Kant, so Husserl is a Kantian thinker in terms of reception. Heidegger, as we shall see, is also very much, up till 1930, obsessively Kantian. So this is, I would say, Neo-Kantianism is not just these dudes, it's these guys, and it's these guys. the whole thing is that there was a European movement. Kant, as you probably know, is politically very much a liberal, a leading liberal thinker. I'm writing a paper at the moment on Kant's politics, 2 papers on Kant's politics, and Kant's politics for Kant is totally tied up with everything else he's doing. He's not just a political thinker, he's not just a scientific thinker, he's not just an artistic thinker, he's thinking about it all at once. He's a systematic philosopher. So these guys are, the reception of Kant is always complex because Kant is complex. So they are very much starting from the critique of pure reason, and just as the English-speaking tradition is. So they're looking at the same text as the English-speaking world is generally obsessed with the first critique in the second edition. They are as well. Simmel is thinking more broadly. He's one of the founding thinkers in modern sociology. So he's looking at Kant's politics, he's looking at Kant's ethics, and coming up with some ideas to create structure for the founding discipline of sociology. And so is Dilthey. Now, Dilthey's obsession is the third critique. So he's much more into the Kant of the third critique, the Kant who invented the word worldview, Weltanschauung, in the Critique of Judgment. So Dilthey's a third critique guy, very broadly speaking. These are first critique guys. And of course, Frege, as if you know him at all, he's very much a first critique guy. He's obsessed with Kant's philosophy of mathematics because that was his discipline. Brentano, as I said, I should have branched him off because although Brentano is important for Husserl, he's not particularly Kantian. Is that okay to start with? I just thought a map would be helpful. Any questions on that? No, you're all right. Okay, so there's the map. So I'll take you back to that. So I've been looking at, this was an excellent book that was a great help to me by Delbert Reed, who's at Minnesota. It's called The Origins of Analytical Philosophy. The problem with the world of analytical philosophy is it doesn't do history. It doesn't do its own history. It doesn't do anyone else's history. It treats philosophers as sort of quarries for digging out arguments and analyzing arguments. Doesn't it, Harry? And this is why Hegel and Heidegger aren't popular, because they're not seen to be coming up with arguments so much as just chanting mantras and coming up with poetry in prose. So he's interesting because he shows systematically from Kant's own texts, Kant's logical texts, Kant's published logical lectures, but also from the critiques, that he shows that Frege is deeply indebted to Kant. Here's Frege. I always think of him as rather a grumpy chap, but Frege was obsessed with Kant, and so I'd say he's part of Neo-Kantianism, broadly speaking. I think there was no such thing as Neo-Kantianism. I don't have a realism of that term. I take a nominalist view of these historiographical labels. So I would say Frege is very much part of the Neo-Kantian world, and certainly is in how he's absorbed by Husserl. Can I read you a couple of things? Just a quote from Reed, quoting someone else. The analytic tradition emerged from Kant's philosophy in the sense that its members were able to define and legitimate their views only by means of an intensive, extended engagement with and partial or complete rejection of the first critique. With the development of his new logical language, Frege invented a new logical script, the Begriffsschrift. Frege believed that he had a means to expand the scope and power of conceptual thought beyond the limits posed by Kant's critical philosophy. Frege felt he was overleaping Kant back to Leibniz. Leibniz is, of course, the founding figure of modern German philosophy, and so Kant is inherited through Wolff and others, the tradition from Leibniz. Frege wants to leap back over Kant and say Kant's logic is too limited. Logic had developed since Kant, like many other special sciences. A big problem for Kant is he proposes this fixed synthesis, including logic and physics and chemistry, and within his own lifetime, chemistry was developing so fast that Kant had a big wobble. Having thought he'd finished the critical philosophy, he then thought, oh no, chemistry, I've got this wrong, and he started an unpublished work called we now call the Opus Posthumum. the posthumous work. So Kant got wobbled by the fact he couldn't get hold of history and hold it tight as a permanent acquisition because the sciences were changing. But of course, I feel Kant should have had the confidence of his own convictions that, yes, the sciences were changing, but if he believed what he'd written about metaphysics, then he would have understood that was a permanent thing. And he sort of did, but he got in a bit of a wobble about it. But Frege said, logic has developed, and I'm developing logic beyond Kant. So I'll read you a little bit about Frege. One of the central aims, and there's a reason I'm doing this, because it's to do with Husserl's early development. One of the central aims of Frege's two great early works, the Begriffsschrift in 1879, and the Foundations of Arithmetic, or Grundlagen, from 1884, was to refute Kant's claim that arithmetic is a synthetic a priori science. You'll remember, Arnel, that Kant says arithmetic and geometry are both synthetic a priori. Yeah?
Yeah.
And Frege doesn't disagree on geometry, but wants to disagree on arithmetic. He wants to reduce arithmetic to logic, which was a project that Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead also inherited from him. So Frege is a first blast at trying to disagree with Kant. And then in a rarely little known concession at the end of his life, Frege admitted he was wrong and Kant was right. I'll have to find the quote, but he basically had to agree that as he'd reflected on it, he had to come to the conclusion that perhaps Kant had been right and both were synthetic a priori after all. But the key point, sorry, I don't know which quote's which, but the key point I'm making is that Frege is deeply engaged with Kant. Now, Husserl, we think of Husserl as the Husserl of, for example, the Idean one, the ideas, and the Husserl of the Crisis of the European Sciences, his last work published, or possibly the Husserl of the Logical Investigations. But the Husserl of the Logical Investigations was 40 years old. There's quite a lot going on with Husserl. He has a lot of momentum before he gets to the Logical Investigations, let alone the rest. And then there's more than 10 years of dialogue with other influences before Husserl comes up with ideas and his transcendental philosophy. So Frege is a big influence on Husserl in the sense that Husserl's first publication Husserl was a mathematician, essentially, a philosopher of mathematics, and studying astronomy, natural sciences, mathematics. So that's where Husserl began, very much like Kant. And Husserl tends to end up repeating Kant's journey. I was fascinated studying Husserl's intellectual development, that he retreads. As Kant starts with the sciences, but has political passions, then he comes up with a logic to branch. Kant's whole passion was to find a logic that would branch between, that was competent for the natural sciences and for ethics and politics. That was Kant's project. And he gets stuck down a long channel of developing this logic in the critiques before he branches out again in the 1790s with his politics. I was interested in how Husserl repeats that to some extent, but not as well. Husserl starts in the natural sciences, becomes very interested in the logic and justification epistemology of the natural sciences. And then Husserl, having developed a new logic, which is the logical investigations, basically, then with much debate with the relevant sources, as he becomes successful and gets a professorship and settles down, Husserl starts to explore beyond the natural sciences, beyond philosophy of mathematics, and gradually his epistemology, if we can call it that, his phenomenology, develops. And Husserl ends his career very much on the same page as Kant in the third critique, talking in terms of history, historical development, culture, worldview, not quite politics, but Husserl becomes a cultural thinker. And many commentaries on Husserl will tell you that there's the Husserl of phenomenology, the scientific Husserl. He was 50 when he published this one, The Ideas, which is probably his central famous text. And they say this one, he's contradicting himself. He's tired, he's old, and he moves. But no, I found that there was enormous continuity from the logical Husserl to the historical critical culture, historical cultural critic Husserl, I found that he was the same guy. And that he actually anticipated a lot of what Heidegger had to say. Heidegger, I think, today takes too much credit for being the great developer of phenomenology and being the original thinker. I think Heidegger is absorbing a heck of a lot of other influences. And sometimes there's loss of data, loss of information, I feel, with Heidegger. That's not to say he's not wonderful, he is, but I think Heidegger sometimes gets the credit for things that he didn't invent. And this was an extremely helpful book. Staiti is, Andreas Staiti, where is he? He's an assistant professor of philosophy at Boston. Have you come across him, Kelly?
No, I'm not. Who's that?
Okay. Husserl, I picked this up in Cambridge, Husserl's Transcendental Phenomenology.
Okay, I've not read that one.
No, well, it's brilliant because the problem is that the Neo-Cantian movement is very neglected in English-speaking philosophy. So there's very little out there about it. In fact, as he points out, and this is quite a recent book, that a lot of Dilthey, a lot of Windelband, Rickert, these dudes, it's not even being translated into English. So if you're not a German reader, a lot of this isn't available and hasn't been for 100 years. So this is groundbreaking and has been much well praised because Staiti shows that just how much a lot of what I'm saying comes from this book, although from others as well. He shows that Husserl is very much building on the Neo-Cantian movement, is engaged with the Neo-Cantian movement. If I can read you some. I'm interested in Kant's systematics, and if you mess with Kant's systematics, you mess with his outcomes, which is his liberal politics. You probably know about Heidegger becoming a Nazi, and I think they're not unrelated. So let me read you, if you don't mind. I'll just read you a couple of revelations here. He says, the 19th century was a long one in philosophy. You can say there's a long 19th century, as historians often do. They start from the French Revolution, end with the First World War. Well, Staiti suggests, interesting historiography, that 19th century should begin with Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. Kant begins the 19th century, which is not that controversial, but he's saying perhaps it also ends with Husserl. Husserl is a late 19th century thinker in many ways, which I thought was an interesting point. And he backs it up, of course, with the whole book. So what happened was Husserl was engaged with Frege. Sorry, I didn't finish the Frege story. Husserl wrote his book on Foundations of Arithmetic, and basically Frege reviewed it very negatively and said, you got this wrong, Husserl, you young upstart, you've misunderstood. And he accused Husserl of psychologism, of reducing the natural sciences to psychological explanation, which was fine in England. You know, John Stuart Mill had just done it in some depth with the science of logic. But that was, you know, seen as against the grain in Germany, where idealism or something more rigorous than empiricism reigned. So Husserl was stung by these criticisms and rethought everything. Sorry, I'm backtracking here. Husserl rethought everything and thought, okay, so I need to think about what is the relationship between logic and psychology. If I'm trying to reduce my mathematical thinking and implicitly my epistemology to psychology. And this was Husserl's journey until the logical investigations, the first book of which in 1900 is a ripping apart empiricism, ripping apart naturalism. It's a powerful text. I haven't got it with me, sorry. Powerful text undercutting everything that the 20th century English-speaking philosophy has been about. It's actually quite Kantian in flavour, but he didn't really realise just how Kantian he was being with the logical investigation. So, and that's the beginning of Husserl's development. Sorry, I had to backtrack. So Staiti talks about where Husserl's coming from. He says, for example, the Neo-Kantian movement was partly structural because Kant had offered a really effective synthesis of all this masses of knowledge in the 18th century, But of course, we'd had a century of development in all the special sciences. So we needed the center, metaphysics, to adapt. And in the second half of the 19th century, the impressive flourishing of historical, literary, political, and economic studies, economics being a new science that was founded in Kant's time, really, whose high standards of rigor could hardly be disputed, called for philosophical elucidation. And one major new science, of course, that's developing in Husserl's lifetime is psychology. Husserl meets Wilhelm Wundt, a famous experimental psychologist busy developing his lab. This has a big effect on Husserl. Then Husserl sits in the lectures of Franz Brentano, who's developing a more, what shall I say, a more theoretical psychology, and beginning to develop towards what we now call phenomenology. So Husserl is deeply impacted by Wundt and by Brentano, and he thinks, okay, I need to incorporate psychological thinking into philosophy. How does philosophy relate to empirical psychology? This is a question Kant addresses, but Kant feels that he can keep psychology as a minor science, as an empirical science. He doesn't feel it has many a prioris in it. Husserl is beginning to think, actually, we need a more rigorous view of the relationship. Right, Saity's basic view. Is this okay, Kelly? Yeah. He says, Neo-Kantianism does not provide merely the background out of which Husserlian phenomenology would develop, but rather the intellectual space in which Husserlian phenomenology displays its own philosophical potential. The phenomenological ontology, and furthermore the transcendental phenomenology envisioned by Husserl, are theoretical projects deeply consonant with the preoccupations of the Southwestern thinkers. So the Southwest is, I'm talking about Friedman, I'm talking about Windelband and Rickert. So Husserl starts with interaction with the Southwestern Neo-Kantians. So Husserl wrote this book as a sort of an attempt to sell his phenomenology to the Neo-Kantians. His intended audience was Windelband and especially Rickert. He wanted the Neo-Kantians to get on board with phenomenology as he conceived it. The roots of this book lie in the fifth and sixth logical investigations in 1901, but he's massively expanded it and he's trying to develop a whole new science. This is deeply indebted to Brentano. It's very much Brentano's vision, which Husserl had heard in his youth, but it's greatly developed. So Husserl is trying to, and the Neo-Kantians, to his disappointment, were not impressed. They said, no, this is far from what we consider to be Kantianism. What I love about Saity's argument is that he says, actually, Husserl is in many ways being more faithful to Kant than the Neo-Kantians. So these boys all think, especially the Windelband and Cohen, Rickert and Matop, they're disagreeing about the interpretation of Kant, and I'll talk about more detail about that later. But Husserl is in many ways digging back into Kant's vision. He's worming his way through the edifice of Neo-Kantian thought, and actually, Saity argues, finding his way back through to the real Kant. Husserl realizes this rather late in the development of his thinking, before ideas. But there is a wonderful tribute to Kant in Ideen and in Ideas. I've been teaching myself German while I've been doing all this, so I've been starting to read it in German, but I haven't got much Husserl in German. I've got lots of Kant. So, yeah, quite a famous talk, bit from, sorry, I'm just finding some quote from Husserl. Yeah, Husserl says, this is from Ideas. He says a lot about Kant, but he says, phenomenology supplies the definitive criticism of every fundamentally distinct science, and in particular, there with the final determination of the sense in which their object can be said to be. It clarifies their methodology in the light of first principles. It is therefore not surprising that phenomenology is, as it were, the secret longing of the whole philosophy of modern times. The fundamental thought of Descartes, in its wonderful profundity, is already pressing toward it. So Descartes is seen as a precursor, And Husserl wrote the Cartesian Meditations, rethinking Descartes' own meditations. Hume, a psychological philosopher of the school of Locke, and we know Hume is deeply related to Kant, almost enters its domain, but his eyes are dazzled. I'll tell you that Husserl changes his mind and gets more into Hume later. The first to perceive phenomenology truly is Kant, says Husserl, whose greatest intuitions first become quite clear to us after we have brought the distinctive features of the phenomenological field into the focus of full consciousness. It then becomes evident to us that Kant's mental gaze rested on this field. The transcendental deduction of the first edition of the Critique of Pure Reason, for example, says Husserl, already moves strictly on phenomenological ground. But Kant misinterprets the same as psychological and therefore eventually abandons it of his own accord. Well, that's a very controversial reading of Kant's first critique. But the point I'm making is Husserl openly acknowledges Kant. He says Kant is working towards what I'm doing. At that stage, and in the last few years before he wrote this in 1913, or published it, Husserl had really dug into Kant properly for the first time, as far as I can see, not secondhand via someone else, via Frege, via Nator, via Rickert. He dug into Kant for himself, which I think was rather important for this development. There was a rather lovely quote I had from Husserl. He said, in Marburg Neo-Kantianism, it is not the whole Kant who lives on. Crucial statement from Husserl. This is from his unpublished works. In Marburg Neo-Kantianism, that's Cohen and Nator, and those their people, it is not the whole Kant who lives on. The whole Kant can only be drawn out of Kant's own writings. I think that's quite important in terms of the historiography of the situation, that Husserl has realized that Neo-Kantianism, can you see this all right? Yeah, is these guys, he says, are not the whole story. He's interacting mainly with Freiberg. Now, Rickert is an interesting thinker. I think he's underappreciated. Most of the Neo-Kantian scholars at the moment think he's underappreciated, and he's certainly undertranslated, underpublished. So Rickert is hard to get, except in small selections in English. But Rickert had a big, he lived till 1936, had a long life, even though he was as old as the others. He lived the longest of the first generation of Neo-Kantians. He had a big effect on Husserl. Rickert also trained Heidegger. Heidegger did his dissertation under Rickert. So Rickert's an important figure for all of these people in the Freiberg side of things. So the Freiberg side, we're interested in Kant's philosophy of science, Critique of Pure Reason, and the metaphysics. And the opus posthumum if they had access. The Marburg Neo-Kantians were also into the Critique of Pure Reason as Kant's main text, but their emphasis was on the logic primarily, and they were more interested in the logic than anything else. And Ernst Cassirer is the big figure there who has a big interaction with her. There's respect between Cassirer and Husserl, but Heidegger and Cassirer is the big dispute, as we'll talk about later. So, the Marburg school and the Freiberg school both agree on a fundamental structural. Can you see this? I've done a little diagram. Just trying to get it visible. I've called it Kant's architectonic. Very simple diagram, just summarizing Kant. So Kant's got the fundamental distinction of the understanding, Verstand. Sorry, can you not see that? To get this right, to get used to it. There it is. So Kant's got his fundamental. Sorry?
Yeah, that's better. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So he's got Verstand versus Sinnlichkeit, understanding versus sensibility, fundamental distinction for Kant. But he's got a double meaning of understanding, of Verstand, which is slightly confusing, but it's easily elucidated from the text, and a lot of the critics and commentators have found it. So there are three central functions of the understanding level for Kant, which is the understanding in terms of perception, judgment, and reason. Reason is the one, as you probably know, which leads off into practical reason, is essentially ethical in character, and only has a regulative role for theoretical understanding that reason regulates understanding in the Critique of Pure Reason, but reason also is Kant's bridge into ethics. So reason is essentially the executive function, if you think of it in terms of government metaphors, which Kant does. Reason is executive, understanding is legislative, judgment is judicial. So in terms of the American Constitution, if you like, you've got this is Congress, this is the Supreme Court, and this is the President. This is the White House. So, and this works microcosmically all the way down the levels of government, but that's a separate issue. But Kant makes that parallel. All of these come under understanding in the general sense of including all these called the higher cognitive faculties. He calls them the Erkenntnisvermögen, the knowledge faculties. But he's basically always got these three under the general heading of understanding as a rule. And the logic applies to logic as Kant understands it, inherited from the Stoic tradition via the medieval scholastic logic, applies to this realm. So the understanding is controlled by the necessary a priori rules of logic, and these are its functions. But of course, Kant also has the separate realm of sensibility, which, although it's quite hard to find it, I have found analysis that shows how these correspond, that sensibility if you think in terms of Hume's treatise of human nature, Hume basically is only interested in this level, sensations, passions, desires. Hume thinks that's all we really exists, and reason is their slave. So this is the slave of that. Kant, of course, disagrees, turns things upside down. Kant wants that to be in charge, and the sensibility, Sinnlichkeit side of us to be under the control of reason. Kant is, in a sense, more of a rationalist with an empiricist bent. So, and you could say that logic deals with this realm and psychology deals with this realm. Is that clear enough? And what's interesting, that simple structure, which is, basically how Kant understands things, with each area of reason ruling, each area of understanding ruling an area of sensibility. This systematics is fundamental to the reception of Kant. So these Neo-Kantians reject the fundamental distinction. Wendelbaum, Cohen, and their followers, they reject the fundamental distinction that Kant made between these two realms in different ways. But they fundamentally agree with the idealists like Fichte and Schelling and Hegel, that this is not a valid distinction, but this is fundamental to Kant. If you break apart the structure that Kant has set up, this delicate architectonic, you're basically knocking over a house of cards, because once that distinction has gone, Kant's philosophy falls apart, and you end up just with a carcass that you're picking at, much as we do in the analytical world, where Kant is very much a carcass to be picked at. If you've ever read Jonathan Bennett's famous commentary on Kant, Kant's Critique of Pure Reason from the 1960s, he explicitly says Kant's philosophy it's all hopeless, it's a load of rubbish, but we can pick out the best arguments. Well, in a way, that's actually what these Neo-Kantians were doing. They're messing with Kant in a big way. They reject Kant's own judgments of the fundamental distinctions to be made. And I think I've been studying for a year now Kant's working out of his systematics into his politics and his ethics and his social theory, which are much neglected. Kant the whole reason Kant wrote his three critiques was to get through to the metaphysics. He wanted to get to his metaphysics of natural sciences, which he did publish in 1786, but then wanted to update. But really, Kant's big project was metaphysics of morals, which he published in 1797, 1798, no, twice in 1797, sorry, which was his metaphysical foundations of law, of right, his legal theory, and his metaphysical foundations of virtue. Tugendlehre. So it's the Rechtslehre and the Tugendlehre, the politics and the ethics. They are really what Kant was about. And if you study the working out of Kant's critical systematics, Kant's architectonic into his legal theory, for example, his constitutional theory, which he's writing at the same time as the American Constitution was written, the French Constitution was written, Kant has a reason for all of this, that his view of the human understanding, his reason's understanding of reason in Kant has massive implications for Kant's social theory, his political theory. And so this is the microcosm inside each of us, inside our reason, for the macrocosm of the state and of human society. If you mess with this, you mess with the wider constitution. You try to reduce one thing to another and break down the walls that Kant has built. I put these lines like a table to symbolize the walls that Kant has got in his head. These structures Kant has set up are there for a reason. And Kant's trying to develop a cogent defense of liberalism, which is itself a critique of the French Revolution, the American Revolution. But if you mess with Kant's systematics, you end up messing with Kant's outcomes. And you don't have a defensible form of liberalism. That's Kant's view. So I'm just saying that these are important. Now, a thinker in this reception story of Neo-Kantianism who respects this more and more is Cassara. I do feel that Cassara is beginning, he's learning all the time. He's a sophisticated, as Dilthey and Nathorp were, Cassara is a sophisticated Kant scholar. He does know his way around all the critiques. He understands the Kant that relates to Rousseau, the Kant that relates to Goethe, and the Kant that relates to Newton. So Cassara is a proper Kantian. And I think politically Cassara is not far from Kant. What happened was that during the politics behind this during the 1920s, as you may know, is that after the First World War and the demise of the German Empire, we had the Republic, and Germany was a republic. For the precious years between the First World War and the rise of Hitler, which wasn't long, of course, but from 1918 till 1933, they had 15 years. They muddled along. It wasn't a great success, which is why Hitler succeeded in destroying it. But the Weimar Republic that ran Germany was politically liberal. Cassara was a product of that. He was, as a Jewish man, he was tolerated. He was allowed to flourish and publish, as Cohen, his predecessor, his grandfather, as it were, at Marburg, had done as a Jew. A lot of these are Jewish thinkers. Husserl himself was originally Jewish. He was racially Jewish, as was Cassara. And of course, Cohen, I don't think Nathorp was, I think he was Gentile. But the liberal republic in Germany, which was tolerant and inclusive and pluralist, the politics of it was very Kantian. And it's a lot of Kant's political thinking is built into that republic, and Cassara is part of that. I think Husserl is feeling his way back into Kant's systematics. I think what Husserl's doing is as he's beginning to understand Kant better, I think Husserl ends up out-Kanting the Kantians. He becomes more faithful to Kant's own vision overall than many of the Neo-Kantians were, and certainly more than Heidegger, who doesn't want Kant to be right because he's not ultimately a liberal. So
I have a quick question about the Neo-Kantians who rid Kant of those fine distinctions happening in the understanding. Is it that we lose freedom and the power of the will whenever we lose those distinctions?
Yes, because this distinction, for Kant, works out into his ethics, because he denied knowledge to make room for faith, the famous saying from the preface of the second critique. So he's basically limiting, he's limiting the role of empirical understanding, which is the understanding ruling over perception over these things. He's denying a role to this half, the sort of our lower half, although he never calls it that, because he wants to free up our ability to have non-sensory perception. So Kant wants to have an ethics which is free of the limitations of the sensory. He wants to have an ethics which is essentially led by reason, and practical reason. In order to liberate that, he needs this strong division here. He believes that if you start with just these things, the political equivalent of this is pure democracy, which Kant doesn't want and doesn't think will work. But equally, he thinks this is going to end up with some sort of rigid bureaucracy. So what Kant's trying to do is liberate reason to relate to the ideas, to purely intellectual phenomena. The only way he can do that is by having these distinctions. Is that all right?
Yes.
This
I love this thoroughness.
this distinction in Kant's systematics works its way through. So ultimately, this is going to take us to the first critique, because ultimately, in the first critique, all of the higher faculties are just controlling sensibility, perception. It's a philosophy of science, natural sciences. Whereas, and he's limiting metaphysics. Whereas, what Kant wants is to liberate this upper half in his ethics to operate. So this ends up being the realm of freedom, ultimately residing through reason. This is the realm of freedom. This is the realm of nature. You could put it like that. So the nature-freedom distinction in Kant is lined up with this. And if you break down the distinctions, then you lose. What Kant's trying to do is protect freedom. He's trying to protect freedom from determinism, metaphysically speaking. Kant's one of his big obsessions in the first critique is to protect the realm of freedom, the realm of morality, our ability to choose, our dignity as human beings, our personality, as he calls it, Persönlichkeit. He's trying to protect the realm of freedom and personality, and so that it is free from determination. And he doesn't just mean metaphysical determination, as you will generally hear in English-speaking commentaries. He's talking about political and social determination. Kant is trying to protect the realm of human freedom, literally, in the political sense. So he believes that this distinction protects that if you liberate this realm, it's hard to convey in one diagram, but basically that's what I'm trying to say, is that you're protecting reason, giving reason its rights, frees you up to launch off into the world of the ideal, up into the world of freedom. Is that okay?
Yeah, and it protects objectivity and logic from the very destructive, sensible world.
Absolutely. There's a little bit of Plato going on in Kant all the way through. The more I've dug into Kant, the more I've thought he's actually a lot more Platonist than I thought he was. Yes, there is a lower, higher thing going on. But he's very much trying to protect the realm of freedom. And so systematically, a lot of the Neo-Kantians, by messing sort of irresponsibly with the architecture of Kant's system, they're actually relinquishing. If you follow through what they've said, it ends up undermining. And I see a sort of metaphorical connection between what these guys are trying to do with Kant and the collapse of the Weimar Republic. I see them as related. I think that the wobbly liberalism of the Weimar Republic, which was not consistently liberal and was quite complacent, to be honest, I see it as it's not unrelated to the ideology they're working with, which is a wobbly Kantianism. I think when I read Husserl's Crisis, I'm talking very broad brush here. I mean, I've said about 5 different theses in a short time, but I'm just a surveying, but this is just my initial survey of phenomenology. But Husserl here, I think he's getting into his Jewishness I'm part Jewish myself, but he's got into his Jewishness, and I think he's speaking quite prophetically. Husserl is seeing that as Cassara had seen, but Husserl is seeing that unless European civilization gets deeply rooted in its liberal values, it's going to fall apart, because he's watching it fall apart. He's saying this in 1937. He's been sacked from his job because he's a Jew. He's essentially in exile. He's wandering all over Europe. And if he hadn't died of old age and illness, he probably would have died in the camps. Husserl was very much saying, help, help, help. We need to resurrect European culture beyond the war. And in many ways, Husserl's vision here is he's getting more and more deeply, and at the end of his life, in his late 60s, 70s, he's grasping I think what Kant was getting at in the 1780s and 1790s. I think he's got quite close to Kant's vision. Another thinker I haven't got in front of me, but who I've found the same in this way, is Jacques Derrida. I'm very interested in Derrida. His trajectory begins where I'm ending today with French existentialism. That, Derrida starts as a child of Paris he's not from Paris, he's Algerian, but he's Jewish. Derrida starts in Paris in the 60s with his, being very much a Sartre type guy, but Derrida develops, and in his last works, in his last 10 years, 95 to 2005, Derrida really, like Husserl, gets into his Jewishness more and more, works with more and more Jewish scholars. Sorry, I could say a lot more, but it's all next door. I don't want to leave you and go and get my books. But Derrida, I think, he really digs Kant the liberal, and I think Derrida understands more and more what Kant was getting at. Not systematically in terms of the architecture that I've been talking about, but I think he gets the heart of what Kant's about. Derrida is an extraordinary character. Anyway, that's another story.
Well, so to take it back to Husserl, would you say that his search for an absolute standard of measure for objectivity in essence mirrors Kant's search for the absolute measure in ends?
I don't think so. I don't think Husserl, in terms of his journey through the sciences, as I said earlier, I think Husserl, he gets from the natural sciences to logic and the cognitive sciences, and that's where he defines his phenomenology. I don't think Husserl goes the full distance into ethics, politics, economics in the same way that Kant did.
Oh, right. I mean, just in terms of objective measure, looking for the foundations for objective measure. Do you see a parallel in his constitution built upon essence? Do you see a parallel between Kant's constitution of logic based upon ends and objective law?
Yes, I do. I think Husserl upset the Kantians because he broke the rules. Because Husserl said we can have direct intuition of the non-sensory. We can see essences through experience and we can discern to essence. Now, Husserl claiming that we can have non-sensory intuition, which is what he says in Ideen, in this book, you know, from there on, he believes in that and defends it. That really upset the Kantians, because for a Kantian, no, you can't. There are no intuitions other than sensory intuitions, as it happens for human beings. So yes, I think Husserl is saying something quite radical, but I'm not sure that Husserl is actually that far from what Kant's about, because Kant himself, the more I've dug into Kant, primary literature, and his own words, and secondary, I think Kant actually does break his own rules. Kant believes in this higher level. I think Kant does believe that we have a sort of intuition, and this is where, in the Critique of Judgment, he talks about Weltanschauung, worldview. I mean, the whole word worldview, which comes up in the mathematical sublime section of the third critique, Weltanschauung, it means a view of the world. That contradicts Kant's own view in the first critique, that we can have a view of anything other than a sensory object. So I think Kant is working his way out of his own system to some extent. But I think Kant's systematics needs developing, it needs defending. I disagree with the reading that Kant simply abandons his own systematics or undermines it. I think Kant means what he says, but I think he hasn't found someone to explicate it. Kant's big problem was that he had extremely original ideas very late in life. And so he basically died before he didn't die before it. He got too old to carry on defending it. He was exhausted by the time he produced Metaphysics of Morals and the Anthropology. By the time we get to 1800, he's got young whippersnappers like Fichte coming along and trying to lay claim to his system. And he's saying, no, you've misunderstood me. But it's too late for him to defend himself. I think Kant had a problem with disciples. But they all did. I mean, there's a lot of patricide in the history of philosophy, and Husserl has this problem too. Husserl is very similar to Freud in many ways. Freud, Jewish thinker, same age, inspired by Brentano. Freud and Husserl sat under Brentano in the 1870s, 1880s. Husserl is Jewish. He mentors a young Gentile who's brilliant. And the young Gentile essentially betrays him, succeeds him, betrays his name. Heidegger Husserl pulls all the strings to get Heidegger his seat at Freiburg, and Heidegger just cuts him off, and Husserl was devastated. And the same thing happened with Freud and Jung, of course, though Freud was a lot more pugnacious than Husserl. Jung gets everything he can out of Freud and then says, fine, bye, Pa, I'm going to go my own way. But that's another story. So, okay, so where have I got to? I've got to Husserl. I've done a lot of Husserl. Shall I move on? I think I've talked about Husserl and Kant. Do you have any more questions about Husserl and Kant?
No, this is great. Oh my goodness.
Is it?
Oh
Great.
yeah, this is so
Okay.
invigorating. I love your thoroughness. This is fantastic.
Great. Thank you. Arnel, are you all right?
I'm just like a sponge right now.
Okay.
Just a sponge.
Do you need a coffee?
Later, maybe.
All right. So, having done Husserl, I spent last autumn on Husserl, basically, working through the text I've shown you in depth, because I'm full-time. I've worked through Husserl, his relationship with Frege, his relationship with Brentano. I'd like to know more about Brentano. I want to know a lot more about Windelband and Rickert, who fascinate me. My revelatory book was Staiti, who really helped me to showed me that Husserl is deeply indebted to the Neo-Kantians. He is basically another renegade school of Neo-Kantianism all on his own. So that's enough of Husserl. I'd like to move on to Heidegger. Now, for Heidegger, I like to do biography first. If I'm meeting a new thinker, I like to know something of their biography and setting. Then I like to do their primary texts. So I read their own words in their own language if I can, and then I'll get to the secondary literature. So with Heidegger, I started with some biographies. This was a fascinating biography by a Jewish writer about Hannah Arendt, the Jewish thinker. Do you know Hannah? Yeah. Now, Hannah is now thought of as a political thinker, but as a young woman, this pretty young lady here, she was a student of Heidegger's and went to Heidegger's lectures. Heidegger was married with children, but he had an affair with her. He went off with Hannah and they had an affair. She was Jewish. He was a Gentile who was becoming a Nazi at the time. His wife was already a Nazi and he slowly became one. The big dispute is when did Heidegger become a Nazi, but we'll get to that. So Hannah had a relationship this is about their relationship. It's basically a biography of Hannah Arendt, but it's also in her relationship and it's called Friendship and Forgiveness. And there's a beautiful grace to it because Hannah forgave him for betraying her, forgave him for his Nazism. They both survived the war and they were reconciled after the war. So I learned something about Heidegger from that. And why she loved him and what was wrong with him. I also got, this was brilliant. This is by a guy who works at the University of Freiburg. So he's in the same institution where Heidegger worked and has succeeded Husserl. He is himself a historian. He's professor of economics and social history. He's probably dead now. This is quite an old book, but this is excellent, Political Life. So I read this, the first sort of 150 pages, up to Being in Time. So I wanted to know what formed Heidegger. Brilliant book, very helpful. He says a political life, but it's just a biography, basically, an intellectual history. It's very useful background to the philosophy. He shows that Heidegger was deeply formed by Roman Catholicism. He was born, he's South German, quite, not a peasant, but, not rich. Quite simple outlook on life, and which is behind his later political populism. But he's a very, very, very clever guy. And he was formed by the church. He considered the priesthood, and until surprisingly late in his development as a young man, Heidegger was still very keen to be a priest and to be a Catholic theologian. He was formed in theology, and he never wholly gave up on his Catholicism. The Catholic faith haunted Heidegger. I have a theory, which is just a hunch because I'm still getting to know him, that he grew up with a feeling we need an institution that's a total institution that runs our lives, which was his Catholic upbringing, and I think he transferred it to the state, basically, with his nationalism. So I learned about Heidegger, fascinating. I won't go into too much biography because we're doing philosophy, but it was interesting. I also got a much more of a potboiler, which is, this is a very anti-Heidegger book, but it was helpful, which is about his early development and how he turned into a Nazi slowly. So that took me up to Being in Time. So what I did next was just work through Being in Time, which is a it's a brick of a book, isn't it? I mean, it's 600 pages and it's not easy going. There are disputes online. I've been in a couple of groups. It may be the group where I met Kelly. Which is the harder text, this one or the Critique of Pure Reason? I think it's Critique of Pure Reason because I think that's more complex. It takes a lot of reading to get your head around. I think you can get your head around this in a couple of readings. But I spent 6 months just working through this full time because it's hard. But it was fascinating. He was a brilliant teacher. That's one thing I've learned, as was Husserl. Husserl had a gift for training disciples, as did Brentano. Brentano inspired Freud, Rudolf Steiner, Edmund Husserl, several other great psychologists. Brentano was an inspiring teacher. Husserl was an inspiring teacher. He was surrounded by adoring disciples. They all said he was a wonderful man, a brilliant supervisor. Heidegger too. Everyone who came, like Karl Lowith was a famous one. Hans-Georg Gadamer's the big one. The disciples of Heidegger said he was an amazing teacher. They'd never had teaching like it. He could inspire people. And I did feel that reading his book. He can really take you through things. So as we've got to Being in Time, can I read you some Being in Time in English? Is that okay? We're talking about reception. Now, I've tried to relate Husserl to Kant. There's so much more I could have said. And there's so much more I haven't said yet about Husserl, but I'm going to go back to him because this is inside Husserl's lifetime, 10 years before the Crisis book. So I felt that Heidegger owes a lot of his view of Kant to Husserl. That in this book, Heidegger is still very much Husserl's disciple. I think a lot of people who've studied and read and worshipped this book, the Heidegger of this book, the early Heidegger, have simply not known Husserl. And sadly, I think Heidegger wanted it that way, to be honest. I think he was hoping to succeed and squash his teacher and take the credit for Husserl's thinking. This is a brilliant book. It reminded me of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. It reminded me of Wittgenstein's Tractatus. It's very much a post-World War I existential book, about the human condition. But it's full of illusion. He's coming now. A crucial difference is Husserl is coming from science. He's a scientific thinker. He's coming out of maths. He's coming out of the rigorous sciences and very slowly and painfully working his way towards a broader logic. Whereas Heidegger is starting with theology. He's starting with politics. He's starting with the more human sciences. He's a humanities guy from the beginning. And I think Heidegger improves on Husserl in the sense that he becomes the other half of Husserl's brain. Husserl is still thinking in terms of, he's reluctant to dig into the history. Husserl is thinking at the interface like an analytical philosopher all the time. And that's a great strength of Husserl. He says, this is the problem, let's solve the problem, never mind what everyone else has said. He described himself as a man of science. But this was a weakness to Husserl because he's actually he's inheriting a tradition and he needs to acknowledge he's inheriting a tradition. Heidegger acknowledges that he's inheriting a tradition. So he deals with Kant as a text. He deals with medieval philosophy as text. He deals with Descartes as text. And of course, the postmodernists and Derrida especially have absorbed that way of thinking. So Heidegger is in many ways superior to Husserl methodologically, but I think the core of many of his ideas are borrowed. I said he's essentially on Kant's research team, penetrating the master systematics from within, but not immersing himself sufficiently in the minutiae of the system. As with so many of them, Heidegger is engaged with the Critique of Pure Reason. Just after writing this, he became so obsessed with Kant. I'll just find another book to show you. Hang on. Heidegger's next few years, this is 1929, Kant and the Problem of Metaphysics, a major text in Kant studies in the 20th century. He's digging into Kant's Critique of Pure Reason and the wider critical philosophy, but mainly the first critique, in depth. He's interpreting it, disagreeing with Cassura. This is a brilliant book about the disagreement. This is Cassura, Carnap, logical positivist, and Heidegger. It's about the way that continental philosophy divided from analytical philosophy and sees Cassura as the middle view. But I'll get back to that. Heidegger is obsessed with Kant. In this book, Kant is one of the layers, one of the three main layers behind this book. And afterwards, he just gets into Kant in a big way. He basically meets up with, has a big disputation at Davos in 1929 with Cassirer, disagrees with Cassirer, but Cassirer knows Kant better than him. I think Heidegger's upset. He wants to understand Kant better. So he becomes, anyway, when he's writing this, he's most of his view of Kant, I could tell, is borrowed from Husserl, because quote after quote after quote, what he basically says about Kant in here is what Husserl has already said, or was going to say. So he's got this off Husserl as a rule when it comes to Kant. For example, this is okay, I'm going to read to you. The positive outcome of Kant's critique of pure reason, says Heidegger, lies in what it has contributed towards the working out of what belongs to any nature whatsoever, not in a theory of knowledge. This is a well-known thing. He says Kant is not, the critique of pure reason is not epistemology. That's a big thing of Heidegger's. It's metaphysics. But then he would say that because that's his interest. The first and only person who has gone any stretch of the way towards investigating the dimension of temporality, or has even let himself be drawn there by the coercion of the phenomena themselves, is Kant. It's almost exactly what I read to you from Husserl in Ideen earlier on. So he's borrowing very much from Husserl. He says Kant neglected the problem of being. He basically, I'll summarize because time's running on. His view in here is that Kant has borrowed the Greek view of being. He hasn't really radically rethought. He's created, as Husserl said, the methodology to rethink traditional metaphysics, but he hasn't rethought traditional metaphysics. So Kant's view of being is still essentially, he says here, for example, the Kantian account of time operates within the structures which Aristotle set forth. I've got Aristotle's physics and metaphysics, and Aristotle's view of time is essentially what Kant sees of time. Kant says time is within us, but the thing that is within us in Kant is the same thing that was without us before Kant. Heidegger's point is that time itself needs to be rethought. The concept of time, it's not, Kant has rethought where time comes from, that it's inside us rather than out there. It's not in the thing in itself. But what Kant hasn't done is rethought the concept of time according to his own more radical methodology. That's the point. While this state of Dasein's being is an obvious one, we are not justified in suppressing the ontologically constitutive role which it plays. Even Kant does not suppress it any more than any other interpretation of Dasein. By the way, the word Dasein appears in Kant. People in the English-speaking world hear about Dasein in translations of this, and they think he invented the word. No, he didn't. It's in Kant, and it's in Hegel. I've got Hegel's Logic in German here. I've got a whole section on Dasein. Dasein is very much a Kant and Hegel word, for being. But obviously, it's rethought and redeployed by Heidegger. When Kant uses, this is Heidegger again, when Kant uses the term Dasein, he has in mind the being present at hand of consciousness, just as much as the being present at hand of things. Basically, one of the problems, as Heidegger sees it in Being and Time, is that Kant he's got these different categories of thing, which he gets from Max Scheler, as far as I could see. And Scheler is one of the leading guys in their circle, and he basically says there's things that are things, and there's things that are conscious, and there's the things that belong to the conscious being. There's these different categories for Heidegger, and putting it very briefly, indeed. And basically he says Kant is still stuck in the Greek way of treating everything, including ourselves, as a thing. So the Greek way of thinking, going back to the pre-Socratics, was very good at dealing with things, with the visible, with the sensory, with the out there, the stuff that physics describes. And he's saying that basically you can't do physics of the soul, very broadly speaking. So he's saying that the way of thinking about what is, that is being used in Kant's metaphysics, is still that from physics. And essentially, you could say it goes back to Aristotle having the physics and then writing a book after the physics, and he just calls it the book after physics, which is what metaphysics means. So metaphysics is still too close to physics, is what Heidegger is saying. And metaphysics needs to be rethought, so it's a broader logic or that can cope with the broader sciences. It can span all the sciences. Kant's trying to do that, but he's on the way. And Husserl kind of agrees with that. He's trying to rethink the center of philosophy, metaphysics, if you like, with phenomenology to cope with all the sciences at once. That's one of the main themes of what Husserl's trying to do. He thinks you can go further than Kant did, so does Heidegger. Interesting comment from Heidegger right at the end of the first division of Being in Time, the one on being. He does being, then he does time. He says, the Neo-Kantian epistemology, these guys, the Neo-Kantian epistemology of the 19th century often characterized this definition of truth as an expression of a methodologically retarded naive realism, blah, blah, blah. But Kant too adhered to this conception of truth, so much so that he did not even bring it up for discussion. This has been overlooked, although Brentano has already called our attention to it. The old and celebrated question, says Brentano, with which it was supposed that one might drive the logicians into a corner is this: what is truth? The explanation of the name of truth, namely that it is the agreement of knowledge with its object, will here be granted and presupposed. So Heidegger is digging at what does Kant mean by his metaphysics. In the introduction to the Transcendental Dialectic, second half of the first critique, Kant states, truth and illusion are not in the object so far as it is intuited, but in the judgment about it so far as it is thought. So just to show that Being in Time is part of the reception history of the Critique of Pure Reason of Kant, and then straight afterwards he gets obsessed. This is only the shorter book. He did a massive set of lectures which has been written up, which I didn't bother to buy because I just couldn't be bothered to read this much, but a much fatter book, as fat as Being in Time, which was a phenomenological reading of the Critique of Pure Reason. So Heidegger is deeply engaged with Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. My worry about Heidegger is that, rather like Husserl, he has got to Kant a little late, though not as late, and that he doesn't really have a grip on the whole of Kant's opus. I've spent the last year, while I've been doing these guys, on Kant, and I feel that still we're stuck, as in the analytical world, with the Critique of Pure Reason. But Kant's Critique of Pure Reason is, for Kant, is completely subservient to his ethics. Kant is basically a liberal trying to construct a liberal political philosophy, and that's what he's doing most of the time, as well as doing philosophy of science. And I feel that Heidegger is still talking about Kant as if Kant's main interest is epistemology, even though he says that's not what Kant's doing, if you see what I mean. So I think Heidegger isn't that bothered about what Kant actually says. What he's trying, and he admits this, by the way. Later in life, he said, my interpretation of Kant was too violent, was his words. I twisted Kant to say what I wanted him to say, which he does. But he does it very well because Heidegger is engaged with Kant's systematics. He really is. He takes it seriously, as Cassara had done. Heidegger is engaged. Now, Kant says, I'll end here, Kelly, because I've taken a lot longer than I thought I would to say what I've said. But Kant comes back to this distinction, Heidegger comes back to this distinction, understanding sensibility, Verstand, Sinnlichkeit. And Heidegger, interestingly, he doesn't want to simply break down the distinction, as the Neo-Kantians have done. He's very conscious of what they did. He's coming from the Freiberg group, but he's relating to the Marburg group, represented by Cassara. And Heidegger says, no, we don't want to break down this distinction exactly, but he does want there to be a higher faculty that both are subsumed into. So basically, he wants understanding and sensibility to both be branches of a deeper faculty. So Heidegger's passion is to find the deeper faculty of imagination. Now, of course, arguably, that's exactly what Kant does in the Critique of Pure Reason, Critique of Judgment. But I don't think that's not exactly what Kant does. Kant is not undermining his own distinction. But Heidegger is saying basically the understanding and sensibility have a common faculty which is deeper than either, which goes behind both, which is, and it is possible to read the Kant's analytic of the sublime in the Critique of Judgment, Kant's concept of the sublime in the Critique of Judgment as being that sort of primordial, that's a favorite word of Heidegger's, primordial faculty. But I don't think that's exactly what Kant is saying. Kant is playing around inside his systematics, but Kant is not undermining his own systematics. I would defend the continuity of Kant's thought. Whereas Heidegger, Heidegger kind of admits that eventually, because he says, you know what, I want there to be a primordial sub-faculty, an faculty, but actually that was my idea. So yeah, so that's where I've got to so far. I haven't got very far with this one yet, let alone the bigger one. So I've got a long way to go. A big difference between Husserl and Heidegger is Nietzsche. I haven't mentioned that, but Heidegger is borrowing from Nietzsche in a big way. I've been studying this book on Nietzsche as a source. It's called Friedrich Nietzsche and the Politics of the Soul. But I'm very interested in how, because Nietzsche is not at all keen on Kant, so I'm very interested in how Heidegger splices the two. Heidegger seems to be motivated by very un-Kantian things, but he's using Kant to say it, which makes him an interesting figure.
Yeah, all right. Going back to this distinction between ends and essences, do you think, so is what you're saying that Heidegger's critique of Kant is that he thinks of our inner time is too interrelated with final ends, and not thinking of time in terms of a less purposive understanding of ends, and that Kant's conception of the human as being an end in and of itself is too related to this purposiveness. We need to get beyond that.
Well, I think in Being in Time, Heidegger wants to revision the human as essentially communal, as shared. The Dasein is already part of a community. Yeah, so we're not ends in themselves as individuals. I think for Heidegger, the systematics is that we are ends in ourselves as communities. So there is some credence to these arguments that various critics of Heidegger that the logic of what Heidegger is saying is nationalism, and Heidegger certainly thought that was the logic. Within the 30s, he got to the introduction to metaphysics, and he became an ideologist of National Socialism. So, yeah, I think he doesn't take Kant's. I don't think he has room for Kant's liberal vision. I think the undermining of this distinction is part of that. I think he's saying that humanity is not fundamentally. If you think of this like the American Constitution as the division of powers liberates, yeah, and I think in Kant's architectonic, he's protective of his architectonic because he says if we divide the powers, then basically we don't have the tyranny of reason or the tyranny of anything. And Heidegger wants the tyranny of something. He's happy to undermine all distinctions. There's a connection between Heidegger's metaphysics and his politics.
So is Heidegger an instantiation of radical evil in Kant?
Of
Kant's conception of radical evil?
Oh, no. I'm not into just slating Heidegger, because I think Heidegger's an interesting figure on a journey. After all, if Hannah can forgive him, so can we. He behaved appallingly towards Husserl, but that was never reconciled. He betrayed Husserl and just used him. He used Rickert first, then he used Husserl. He tried to use Karl Jaspers, but Karl Jaspers was wise. He's the great founder of psychopathology, so he knew how to recognize a sociopath when he met one. And so Jaspers realized what Heidegger was about and kept his distance. But I hugely admire Hannah Arendt because she understood what had happened more than most people alive, but she still forgave him. And Heidegger had this sort of afterlife. as this guru person, very like Jung. But yeah, I'm on a journey here, you know, Kelly. This is as far as I've got. I feel I've got more of a grip on Husserl than I have on Heidegger. But I'm getting to know Heidegger. I mean, working through Being in Time, you feel like you've got to know the guy quite well. I was blown away by bits of Being in Time. I mean, he's a very good writer. That's what I meant about him being an inspiring teacher. You know, I think Heidegger has a gift for provoking, you know, digging up at people, which Kant just didn't have. You know, with Kant, you've really got to work on him. Like, I think, you know, Kant is like Mozart, you know, it's beautiful, but it's out there. Whereas Beethoven's like Heidegger's like Beethoven, you know, it gets under your skin.
Yeah. I'd like to hear more. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, Kelly. David, I actually have a couple of questions here, but I'm afraid they're not about the reception of Kant and in Heidegger and Husserl. I'm too new to them to formulate an interesting question. But as I've told you before, I'm actually starting to read Critique of Pure Reason. And I have this question that I had in my head. When Kant was discussing his notion that geometry and mathematics are his proof of synthetic a priori knowledge, situated in space and in time. The geometry part is situated in space, and then mathematics is in time.
Yeah.
And then in his time, there wasn't yet any notion about non-Euclidean geometry.
Correct.
It only came later on.
It did.
And was that such a huge threat to his system?
No. Very good question. I don't think so, because I've got a couple of books about this, because I've looked into the science side of things. I mentioned Einstein, but I looked at Friedrich Gauss, the great mathematician in Romantic era, sort of 1820s, 1830s, 1840s. Gauss thought Kant was right about geometry, for example. I looked at Heisenberg and quantum mechanics, Michael Friedman, brilliant writer, and Einstein's later work. And I think Kant was onto something about mathematics, basically. But yeah, what I was going to say was Kant did anticipate non-Euclidean geometry. I think Kant is often slandered. People who've looked at Kant and don't know the history of maths or science very well, I mean, that's my background, they say that Kant didn't see non-Euclidean geometry coming. So they say, well, because Euclidean geometry was massively relativized by non-Euclidean geometry with Riemann and the next 100 years up to general relativity, they say, well, this outdates Kant. But I think that's very unfair, because if you look into Kant's own views of math, his own philosophy of mathematics, as Frege did, you discover that actually Kant saw that coming. Kant, in many ways, it's controversial, but it's arguable that Kant anticipated the breakdown of Euclidean geometry. That Kant wasn't trapped in the past. I think he's often read very conservatively. I think Kant, Einstein said that he would never have dared to challenge Newton without the inspiration of Hume and Kant. Kant had a massive impact on Einstein. He said, and it's obvious from his trajectory, because I studied Einstein alongside all this, there's no way that relativity theory could have happened if it wasn't for Immanuel Kant writing the Critique of Pure Reason. So, Kant formed the sciences. He discovered, he made a huge breakthrough in stellar astronomy ahead of Laplace. And, Kant was, if you look at atomic physics, Kant anticipated extraordinary things. Him and Boscovich came up with basically the shell theory of the atom that we now believe 150 years early. So, no, Kant was deeply engaged in the natural sciences. And he saw his way through in maths and those. Another good writer that I want to find out more of is Michael Friedman. I've been referring to him indirectly a number of times, but I haven't actually shown you. This guy who wrote about Heidegger and Cassara, his specialism is Kant and the exact sciences, Kant and physics, Kant and maths. He's brilliant, very helpful. So, I think Kant is... there's a flexible, I think Kant's theory of maths is still defensible. That's what I'm trying to say. David Hilbert, 100 years ago, was helping Einstein develop the general theory of relativity. Hilbert and Einstein were in a race to develop the maths behind general relativity, and they were both using Kant. So Kant is formative for modern mathematics. He's not been left behind.
Yeah. Also,
would you say that the spontaneity of the imagination allows for him to anticipate that non-Euclidean geometry?
Gosh, that's putting it very broadly. But if you could connect the aesthetics of the third critique to scientific creativity and the development of scientific theories, but that would be going beyond Kant. But I think it could be done in a way faithful to Kant, yes. Okay.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, Arnaud.
Sure. And also I was thinking about the introduction of non-Euclidean geometry as a threat to Kant's system. He wasn't so much using Euclidean geometry as a proof for synthetic a priori judgment. He was using Euclidean geometry as an example to get people to understand what he means by synthetic a priori judgment. So if in case, just for the sake of argument, that non-Euclidean geometry really does disprove Euclidean geometry, which is against Kant's purpose, it wouldn't so much be a threat to his system because it's just an example. His entire system doesn't rest on that.
What's your question?
I was merely asking for your opinion on that interpretation.
I agree with you. Yeah, I agree. I think that's right. Sorry, my brain's getting tired now.
Well, to take it back to Kant and Husserl. So Euclidean geometry is just one manifold built on certain ideal shapes. And mathematics would allow for other ideal shapes to be created or emerge. And I guess to get to your point, Arnaud, that, I guess that would be like one example. And then Kant's conception of how it is ideals emerge in the first place and gain this objective authority.
In physics, to give a different example, in physics, Newtonian physics is a special case of relativistic physics, So Newton hasn't been disproved by Einstein, he's just been put in his place by Einstein. Newton's physics is perfectly valid if masses are not too large and if speeds are not too high. Everything reduces, the Einstein equations reduce down to the Newtonian equations. So we got men on the moon in 1969, 50 years ago, purely through Newtonian mechanics. It's perfectly valid. So, it's perfectly valid as a description under certain conditions, which are normal conditions. So, I would say the same in geometry, that Riemannian and other non-Euclidean geometries, they don't disprove Euclid, they just make Euclid a special case. So just as Newtonian mechanics is a special case within modern physics, Euclidean geometry is a special case within the wider geometries, and the logic that Kant used is a special case within the wider what are they called? Polyadic logics that we have now. So most of what Kant's saying is not automatically, basically what Kant's saying is still true of most practical science that we use today, but it doesn't stretch far enough. I'm very interested in the ways that we need to update. This was what Michael Friedman was saying in this book on philosophy of science. He was writing about Einstein, and I think that Rickert and some of the Neo-Kantians were onto something about updating Kant. I think Rickert's a really interesting thinker, and from what I know, and I'd like to know him better. My German isn't good enough to do him in German. It's not much in English yet, but I think that the idea of expanding Kant's a priori concept in the natural sciences, loosening it up without destroying the systematics, I think it is possible. I can see a way through. I just don't fully know the way. but I think it's possible to have a defensible Kantian view, and this is Friedman's essential. Michael Friedman seems to believe, knowing Kant very well and knowing natural sciences very well, he seems to believe there's a way through to have a coherent, defensible Kantian interpretation of contemporary science. Kant has not been outmoded.
I personally think, and Arnell and I talked about this last Wednesday, that a more robust
yeah.
set of beauty would allow for a harmonious weighing of multiple theories within one system.
Good.
And that's actually where the law and shared philosophy foundation comes in, and our axioms built on beauty. But anyway, I think,
All right.
I think personally, that's where I think it can come in. We can have a loose, yet still faithful interpretation of Kant.
Well, I've expanded my 1 year tour through Kant to 2 years because I haven't covered the Critique of Judgment properly. I've read it before, but I mean, I haven't done it this round, so I'm wanting to do Critique of Judgment in German and English and get some commentaries in. So this is my year for Critique of Judgment. And I want to do Critique of Judgment with commentary from Fichte and Novalis and, you know, the guys who took it further. So yeah, because the work I've been doing in detail is not this. What I've been up to in detail for my papers I'm writing is Kant's politics. And I found that you can dig into the Rechtslehre, the philosophy of law, and it's tremendously robust. There's a whole research program currently going on in the States in a number of centers on showing, basically vindicating Kant's philosophy of law, saying, you know, I'm writing one paper on the American Constitution, you know, and the Rechtslehre, and I've been very impressed at the robustness, I like your word, of Kant's philosophy of law. And I've just defended him in natural sciences. So yeah, I think Kant is. I think we should trust Kant. I think the evidence is that, you know, it's definitely, you start with. We should be prejudiced in favor of him to start with, and do our best to work within him before we move on. And I think the big mistake in Kantian reception for me, again and again, the big mistake is they abandon the master too quickly. And it's best to run with him as long as you can and run from within. And I keep finding thinkers in different departments. The problem with Kant is he's so broad. I mean, we're all specialists these days, and it's very difficult for anyone to, you know, he's a giant and everyone is smaller than him. So it's difficult to get behind him, you know.
Yeah.
This is great. This is all very helpful for me. My professors are very dismissive of Heidegger, actually. They could talk about Husserl. They're kind of interested in him, but when it comes to Heidegger, they're kind of dismissive. Maybe it's because of the analytic tradition that runs in my university. But
well, it goes back to these guys. In 1933, Rudolf Carnap, who knew his Heidegger very well and knew Kant very well, very bright chap. Carnap wrote, he basically slated Heidegger with knowledge. You know, he took apart Heidegger as bad logic. So he founded the whole tradition of your professors looking down on Heidegger as a bad logician. And I think with reason, I think Heidegger is a bit of a, you know, of a magician. You know, he's a populist. I think he wants to be liked. But I think to be dismissive of Heidegger is to, you know, I don't think we can afford to be dismissive of Heidegger. I think he's, you know, he's very well informed. I don't like him as a person, but I think he's, you know, he's too well informed and too well, it's just, you know, too big a figure to ignore.
Yeah, and now I understand that if I want to specialize in Kant, it's not going to work well for me if I adopt that dismissiveness with Heidegger. It's just going to be a fragmentary understanding.
Well,
I think my understanding is much richer.
Yeah.
If I delve into Heidegger.
Yeah. Well, I think this it would be worth getting this one because it's you know, it's very rewarding, because what I find with reception is that if you read, even if he's wrong about Kant, you know, you learn a lot about Kant finding out why he's wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really need to go.
Okay. Well, David, thank you so much. I'll send a follow-up email and make sure that your friend Harry gets on the email list for participating with us.
Yeah.
But yes, thank you so much. That was a
Thank you so much, David. This is great. This is great.
Well, it was nice for me to get to, having spent a whole year digging into all this stuff and not planning to write, because I feel like I'm still a learner with phenomenology. With Kant, I feel like I spent 30 years with Kant. I know Kant, and so I can write about Kant professionally. But with the phenomenologists, I'm still a child. I'm still learning. So, for me, this was a perfect format because I could express myself, share what I'm learning, share my provisional thinking, tell you where I've got to without anyone minding that I don't know that much.
Well,
and we benefited from that.
I think your reading of phenomenology is fantastic. And I encourage everyone, even if they are, a long-term vet in the field, to keep that childlike perspective. So I don't think that's to your detriment at all. I think I've thoroughly enjoyed your exegesis and your interpretation and your ability to unify these thinkers. This has been such an invigorating conversation.
Good.
Yes, thank you so much. And if you have further presentations you'd like to share, we'd love to have you.
Yeah.
Oh, well, I would. I think it's very good for me doing this. I think I would need another term until I did any more phenomenology. I want to know Heidegger better before I say anything more about him. But on Kant, definitely. I'm happy to talk about Kant anytime. I'm deeply into Kant.
All right. Yeah, just let us know. We'll have you any day of the week.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kelly. Let's stay in touch with the emails, and then and I promise I'll join in with the community now. I'm sorry. Just I work during the day, and in the evening I'm busy with family. So, but
that is understandable. Hopefully, we'll be here for a long while, so you have many opportunities to join us. It's big. No big deal.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. God bless you, and have a lovely evening. Because for me it's late at night, but for you it's just the afternoon. You need to get to bed, Arnel.
True, that's true. But thank you so much. It's really great. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining in. I appreciate it.
All right. Goodbye, you all.
Good night.
Thank you also, Kelly. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.